Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The New Agora. I'm Athenianos.
I'm Matthew Brown.
William Hamilton.
Filip Karaivanov.
Excellent. And welcome back, you two.
Yeah,
Second appearance.
Good to be back.
together. I might add, that's pretty exciting. Last time on the kind of ancient philosophy series, we discussed Aristotle's posterior analytics, and this time we're going to be talking about the very famous metaphysics. Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think specifically, for those who are listening, we are going to be talking about chapters 9 and 12, right? So that's where he talks about actuality and potentiality, and then how he moves from there to the existence of a singular God.
Sounds like a plan.
But I think before we get into that meat, we should have some appetizers briefly, some amuse-bouches to kind of set the brief stone for how we're gonna move to that, just so we don't completely lose people from the get-go. Does that sound fair?
Sounds good to me. I think, Philip, you said you
The resident metaphysics expert.
you were
Okay,
enthusiastic to introduce the conversation.
Well, you've thrown me in the deep end here. I think, it was Avicenna who, when he read the Metaphysics, he said that it took him 40 times to read through it, and he still didn't quite fully understand it. So here I
can
go.
relate to that.
Here I go in his place. So I guess the first thing I would like to mention, and maybe you guys could comment on this, because it's related to the distinction between actuality and potentiality, which is the first thing that he talks about in the chapters you mentioned. But before that, he does divide being between matter and form, which is known from the scholastics. They call this hylomorphism. And the idea there is that for Aristotle, every being is made up of the material and then the form. And for him, the form is the more fundamental part. And I think we had a very interesting argument given from him about this. Essentially, he says that suppose that matter is the most fundamental thing. Then in order to get to the substance, you would have to take away the predicates, right? Because for him, substance is the subject of a predicate.
Well, I think we should talk a little bit about substance right now, just because you brought it up, because he does have a unique way of talking about substance, right?
Yes. Well, he has a number of ways of talking about substance, yes.
But substance is particularly that which what's the word he uses? Like can change, basically. Or that's not what the word he uses, but
I don't recall.
you're basically, okay, so let me describe this. You have, let's say you have a person sitting, right? The person is the substance, and the sitting is something else. And
It's separated from something.
right, separated. Thank you. That's what I meant. You can the substance is separable, and the other thing, which I don't know the name, is inseparable. Right?
Yeah, so I think the sitting is something like a predicate, right?
The predicate, yeah. And so the reason the substance is separable is because it can like attach itself to certain properties or actions, etc. So a person can at one point be sitting, and at that point it's sitting, and then it can separate itself from the sitting and then be standing, and then it can separate itself from the standing and then be lying down. And so that's why the substance
So it loses one predicate, gains another, loses that, gains another, or a whole host,
right.
is it?
That's why it's separable, but the sitting is inseparable because it has to have that subject to it. A sitting always has to exist with something else. You can't have sitting without a subject,
Without something that sits.
without something that sits.
Okay.
There's no such thing as lying without something that lies, something that's standing without something that stands.
That's interesting. It's a little, I guess, counterintuitive because I guess you'd think of predicates as, hang on.
Irreducible, I was thinking.
Yeah. So you'd say sitting is inseparable, but hang on, no, I've lost my train of thought. Ignore me. I was going off on.
You guys keep talking.
Yeah, sure.
Well, yeah, so they're attributive, we're saying. But yeah, anyway, so to get back on track with the argument for the form being fundamental, do you want to go ahead with that?
Yes, so the idea was that if you suppose the opposite, that the matter is the most fundamental thing about something, then you would have to strip it of predicates. And actually, this was related to our discussion just now, because the substance is that thing which undergoes change. And it has certain predicates, but it could lose them and still be something else, right? It could still remain itself. So the idea there is that if matter is the substance, if matter is the most fundamental thing, then you should be able to strip it away of predicates and it still be something. And he gets to the point where it just is a three-dimensional thing, right? And then he says, but even that is a predicate. Being three-dimensional is also being something, right? It has a predicate. So he removes that, and then he says, okay, now we have something which is indefinite. Like it's almost impossible. Yeah, it's almost impossible to conceive of what that would be.
Wouldn't that just be space, though? Like or the space in which something is three-dimensional. Like if you remove the predicate of three-dimensional, aren't you still left with space, or does that kind of contain, or are you getting rid of that when you remove the three-dimensional predicate?
Well, yeah, that's still a property you'd have to have. Space still has like properties, I guess. It's not actually devoid of properties.
True.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, space is not a property itself, right? So it's you have something.
I think that's what I was driving at, was that you wind up with something that isn't itself a property. It's like three-dimensional would be a property, but space wouldn't be. So if you remove the three-dimensional predicate, aren't you left with something that doesn't have predicates, if that's space? Or is the idea of three-dimensionality contained in the idea of space?
The idea is that you are left with something without predicates. And that's what Aristotle would call the substance.
Okay.
The problem, however, to get back to the idea that this thing would still be matter, is that now there's no way to differentiate that from everything else. So if we take you and me and this table, and we do this experiment where we take away the predicates that we have, just to see what our basic substance is underlying all these predicates. The problem is that if it's matter, then once you reach this indefinite thing, they will basically be the same thing, right? You would have to be the same thing as me, because what differentiates us once the predicates are gone, if it's just matter? So that's why he says it must be the form, which is the other component of beings. It must be the form that is more fundamental, because that makes you what you are.
And the form is in turn the actuality of the substance?
Yes, exactly. And this goes into the discussion of potentials and actuals.
So how related the discussion to like like essentialism, as in objects have an essential property?
Well, no, because it's not a property.
Have an essential, well then, identity, I guess.
Yes. So it's there's something underlying which is what we call that thing. So maybe the example from Descartes would be more helpful. I know we're bringing Descartes up again, but he has the famous wax example where he says that we call it wax when it looks like a candle, but then once it's melted, it's still wax. But he says all its properties have changed. It doesn't feel the same way, it doesn't smell the same way, it doesn't look the same way. So he's saying, why are we still calling it wax? There must be something underneath it. And underneath all these properties, there must be something that's remained unchanged. And this is the idea that Aristotle is getting at here.
So why don't we take the idea of the form and the matter, and let's move into the first topic of today, which is actuality, potentiality. Because there's a lot of ways that we could discuss this, the relationship between actuality and potentiality. But essentially, right, like he says that actuality is kind of like the end point or the telos of a given thing, and the potentiality is literally the period that or what. So okay, I'll give an example to make it more clear, right? The boy has the potential to be the man, and the man is the actuality of that man, or the process of building a tower. The tower is the actuality of the tower, and the building of the tower is the potential of the tower.
I can see that.
And he says, and this is the part that's interesting, is he says the actuality always is prior to the potentiality. And this is very interesting because you think about a chicken and an egg, right? Everybody says, oh, what comes first? Aristotle would say the chicken comes first. Because even if the egg is the potential of the chicken, and so it seems in some practical sense, obviously you have the egg, and from that egg, right, so the potential of the chicken is the egg, and in some sense, when you have from that egg, you have the chicken, which is the actuality. So in that sense, it seems like the potentiality comes before the actuality, because in order to
Because it precedes it.
it precedes it. But he would say no, because in order for something to be potentially something else, so in order for an egg to be potentially a chicken, there has to already have been the chicken. So in that sense, he says that the actuality comes first. Like a boy can only be potentially a man if you have the man first.
Right, but I can see that because you have to have it's the potential to be something.
Right.
So that something is a thing that
Yeah, so something
already
is
must exist.
that must exist before potentiality.
Right.
Otherwise, what's the potential for?
I actually have a question regarding this. When you say that the man must pre-exist the boy in some sense, right? This is what was said. Do you mean in the sense that he must pre-exist it as a potential, or do you mean he must pre-exist it as an actual?
The man as an actual must exist before the potential of the man.
So where would that be found then, right? Because actual things, I gather from what he says, are basically real things. They're in the world.
Right.
So where would that man be then? Because obviously he's not here, because it's still a boy.
That's the question he tries to, like, because he thinks that everything is in motion, right? And it's in, and it doesn't, and things that are eternal, right? He separates certain substances into three categories, and one of those is eternal, and those eternal things never stop. But he says that there's something that must put those things in motion, which kind of starts that whole loop, and there has to be something that initially starts that, and that's kind of what leads him to posit that there has to be something like a god that starts that process.
And so it's the God that puts the.
It contains all the actual concepts, I guess, within it.
Right, that then brings about the potential for those things, because that God brings about the actuality of man,
Right.
which then sets the chain of potential actuality. Potential actuality.
God is actuality without potentiality.
Okay.
According to Aristotle.
Yes.
He's the only thing without potentiality, and it's just actuality.
Right, because if he has potential, then that unmoved mover would have to be moved again
Right.
by something
Yeah, it
else,
would go
because
back,
that potential would have to be realizable.
And the other thing he says is anything that has potential to be something can also not be something. And so like in that sense, what's he views what's only actual to be at a higher level than what has potential, because the same way that um a boy can be potentially a mathematician, can also potentially not be a mathematician. But something without potential can only be that thing. So it can't be that that initial thing has potential to be that thing, because then it could not be that thing.
I would like to say, I think there is a difference between being possible and being potential, because I think potential is an ontological category for Aristotle. It's something like having a disposition towards the actual, as you said.
Right.
So technically, I would phrase it this way. I would say that the boy could have the potential to be a man, but you wouldn't really say it could have the potential not to be a man. It's possible for him not to grow up to be a man, but there isn't like, an existent negation of the potential. You would just say that the potential to be a man wasn't realized. At least that's how I interpreted it.
But there was some weird thing that he says, where he says unequivocally, the if anything has the potential to be something, that can also has a potential to be its negation in an unequivocal sense.
Yeah, so actually I have an example. So would you say that any man has the potential to be a bachelor for life, but then he also has the potential to be married for life? That's not necessarily a negation, because it's two different concepts, although they're the opposites of each other.
Yeah, that's okay. That's an interesting. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
You mean any man before, obviously.
Yeah.
That's
before.
occurred. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was actually thinking to the idea I had. So if God has, all the actualized potential in that's possible, I guess, in everything, well, then would he have both actualized potentials of concepts like being married and being a bachelor, which are negations of each other?
Actually, I would like to. I apologize. I would like to change that, because technically, if you interpret bachelor as just being unmarried, right, which is what it is, then everybody would be that beforehand, right? You don't become.
But an
you
unmarried man, I guess, if they're boys, they're not bachelors, because it has to be a man.
Okay, sure. Okay, I see what you mean. Well, if you want to define it like that, then yes, as a boy, you would have the potential to be both.
Yeah.
At the same time.
And so would God have the actual property of being a bachelor and then being a married man as well? Weirdly framed question,
But if God is the actuality of all things, then he would have to be the actuality of contradictory things.
yeah, exactly.
So yes, what you're driving at.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because we're talking about
Trying to bring contradictions into the conversation.
Law or non-contradiction will come.
We are talking about like actual things, so I think it's, if you do interpret it as just being the negation, which I think maybe that's what you would say is the proper interpretation, because you did say you said that they're not two negated things, but they actually are, right? Because they're referring to the category of man. You're saying that one is an unmarried man, the other is a married man.
They're mutually exclusive, right?
So
and
you're
the
talking about-
definitions are opposite, but it's not like. I mean, I guess it's just the way it's framed. It doesn't immediately.
But they
seem
are
like it's a
only
negation.
in men, right?
Yeah.
The potential is only in men. So perhaps what you could say is, instead of talking about the boy, once he becomes a man, then you could say he has the potential to be married, but he is not married when he becomes a man.
Yeah. What about when he's a boy?
Yeah, I would say that wouldn't apply then, because it's.
But I think the point is, as a boy, he has the potential to be a bachelor.
To be a man.
To be a. Yeah.
As a boy, he also has a potential to be a bachelor or and he has the potential to be a married man. And the idea is that those are the negations. So him having because he has that potential, he has the potential to be negating. He can either be a married man or he can not be a married man. He has both those potentials. That's, I think, what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense because like you have the potential to be both employed and unemployed. Like using a different kind of example. Like when you grow up, like, oh, you're now at the age where you can work, you have the potential where you can be employed or you can be unemployed, right? Those
True.
are
Right now, that's another one. Like right now, we wouldn't count as either because we're students, right? So
And I think it's
unemployed. But
like I think it's
Well,
important to say that like
we aren't flexing.
the like so he wouldn't say that in the sense that a married man, let's moving from the boy, a married man, he wouldn't say that they have the potential to be a bachelor, because when he's saying like the actualized version of the married man is something like him who is fully committed to the married, like it's the highest, the end goal of that married man state. Let's say there is no, it's a continuum of action of moving toward the married man, and when he hits that final endpoint of the married man in Aristotle's version, he can't then go back to. He does not have the potential to go to the bachelor's life. It's not like, oh, I did the whole ceremony, and therefore I've reached the telos of the married man. But in theory, I could get divorced and then go back to the bachelor's life. That's not Aristotle's vision of the actuality of
you're
the
saying
married man or something else.
because he would be so committed to the marriage that isn't an eventuality that would happen.
The actuality of the married man
Yeah.
is not just somebody who does the whole ceremony and it's a more defined thing. As somebody who is committed and for one reason or another is the possibility, the potentiality of him going to
She could die though.
well,
Like
he
your
wouldn't-
wife could
but
die.
that's not the opposite of like you're
You could become a bachelor again. Like if you're married and then your wife
but
died.
he would say that you can't.
Oh, I see.
How? So what happens if you get divorced? Are you not a bachelor?
Well, he would say you can't because the actualized version of the married man would never get divorced. Like you have to think of some high, some very idealist version of the married man. The same way,
This is sounding like the form of the married man or something.
but it's not.
Yeah, it's not. It's not.
I would actually like to take a completely opposite way of defending Aristotle. Perhaps maybe then what he means here with actuality is more to do with the substance or the concrete thing changing from being one thing to another. And I don't know if concepts like married or unmarried, which I guess you could say are predicates, I don't know if they would apply as fundamental changes, where he would say you're
Well,
being
I think you're right about
actualized.
that. I don't think he would use the example of married or unmarried man.
Yeah, I was just thinking of two terms which would be, contradictory. That's the best I could come up with. But I don't know if you could find one which then would be more.
But I would say like
concrete.
if you're talking about like a musician or musical man, he wouldn't say that the actualized version of a musical man does not have the potential to be unmusical.
Well, I am thinking of the examples he uses because the examples he uses are very concrete. As far as I'm aware, and the closest one to an example like the married, unmarried, or the musician would be the builder. I think, whereas he would say a builder obviously has the potential to build something. But even there, it's the builder is already a builder, right? That's what grants him the potential to build something. So I think to ask the boy, to ask if a boy has the potential to be a married man or an unmarried man, Aristotle would first ask, well, wait a second, he's not a man in the first place, so he doesn't have the potential to be either married or unmarried by your definition that you said. Otherwise, we could just say he's a bachelor as a boy, but you said it's an unmarried man. So I think he would just say he has the potential to be a man, and once he is a man, then he has new potential. But once he's a man, he's already either a bachelor or immediately married, which I doubt is the case. So it's probably he's a bachelor, so he has the potential to be married. So I think that's why he would resolve that contradiction.
What about something like the employed one we were talking about? Because that's not a contradiction. It sounds like it, but unemployed and employed, since we're kind of in between, we'd be students, doesn't count, but they are mutually exclusive at the very least.
What do you mean? I didn't.
So all of us, except for Matthew right now, have the potential to be employed or to be unemployed. And that's not dependent on us, on a condition like the boy and the man is. So now we have the potential to be both.
So would you say right now that you're unemployed?
No, I'm not. I'm a student, so I'm not unemployed.
Okay, I think these are sort of just, now it's getting a bit like semantical, because I think the question is, do you have a job or not? And we don't have a job at the moment, unless you want to consider being a student and job, in which case you'd go the reverse way, obviously. But
no, there are different categories. Unemployed is specifically, to do with, if you're a student, you're not unemployed, because unemployed is kind of, there's even out of the workforce. There's more than 3 categories. So, like if you're a mother caring for children and doing housework, you're not unemployed, because you're out of the workforce completely, because you're not in the job market.
Well, but in a literal sense, you're not employed.
Right, but that's if you treat it as the negation of employed. But that's not what.
Well, I think it is the negation.
It's not that's the point. It's a distinction. It's mutually exclusive to employed, but it's not actually the negation of unemployed.
Yeah, I think the question is more basic than that. It's whether you have a certain property or not. And I think this is sort of like a status, or I'm not sure.
I guess if you think if they're valid properties or not, I suppose you could.
I would dispute that they're. I don't think they're actual properties. I think it's just a situational kind of societal distinction between different states of being. And I use the word states of being loosely, obviously. Well, that resolves that, I hope.
I suppose. I mean, yeah, we are like. I guess it's difficult when you do have kind of, obviously this is a socially created distinction, because generally we tend to think that socially created distinctions still seem to point to something, like they're not vacuous when we speak about them ultimately. So, but obviously there are cases where sometimes it is, in the end, it is just made up. It's not really based on anything. A lot of social categories are like that. So yeah, possible.
But to bring it back to Aristotle, so because I think the point you made, Philip, was that these examples of venturing into the semantic and kind of away from the concrete, which is where Aristotle would be more concerned with his description of actuality and potentiality. Is that what you meant by that?
Yes. Because for him, potentiality, that's why in the beginning I said it's different from possibility. Because we're not just talking about if something is possible to happen. It's not about possible world. It's an actual state of existence that is somehow in between full being, as you would, and non-being. That's what it means to be a potential.
I think it's also worth mentioning actuals and potentials in terms of motion and actions, things like seeing, things like running, things like I don't know, breathing, right? Because he says that it's interesting because when in the case of seeing, he says that when you are seeing something at the same time, you have seen it. So the literally the act of seeing something, seeing an object, seeing this microphone, seeing this tissue box, seeing this notebook, is an actuality. It's the actualization of the potentiality that I had of seeing. So when I'm closing my eyes and looking the other direction, I have the potential to see this microphone. And when I see it, that it's the immediate actualization of seeing this thing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then so in the case of like running, for example, you would say you have, let's say somebody is running, I don't know, 200 meters, right? So there's the end point, which is when you reach 200 meters, that is the actualization of the running 200 meters, but also, in some sense, the act of running, is an actualization of your potential, to run.
Right. So kind of like Philip used the word realizing. Oh yeah. So like in the process of running the 200 meters, you are actually realizing that potential by
Right.
doing so.
Right.
Because you could not complete the 200-meter run and then fail to realize it.
You could.
That makes sense.
I just thought we should mention that because he talks about that in his in the chapter, and Aristotle these are lecture notes, as Philip mentioned last time. We don't really have his dialogues, so his writing is not as clear and poetic as Plato's. So it can be sometimes difficult to figure out what he's saying.
Yeah, I do want to add to that distinction. Yeah, it's correct that the actualization obviously has to be actual, because it can't be like a potential actualization, because it wouldn't be an actual actualization. There would be no running, for example, if it's just potential running.
Sure.
But that does also add to the fact that for him, the potential is dependent on the actual in a fundamental sort of way, because potentials are contained in actual things. Right, so the potential to be a man is contained in an actual boy. Right, if there was no boy, then that potential wouldn't exist just out there. So
then how is he moving? How is he moving from this distinction? We touched on it briefly before, but how does he move from there to articulating the existence of a god? And I say a god because even though they had the Greek gods at the time, he specifically alludes to the notion of one god rather than many.
Capital G God.
Capital G.
right, well, I'll give it a shot. It's similar to Aquinas's argument that he gives in the Summa Theologia. Essentially, what he says is that some things are in motion, which would be this idea of change, right? So for the ancient Greeks, motion is just change in general, which is what we just talked about, the actualization of a potential. And the question then is, how does this actually occur? And you have to have something that is already actual, which is the cause of that, which is pretty straightforward. The cause obviously can't be potential, because if it's potential, then it's not actually there. So
to
it can't.
cause something.
Exactly. So you have to have an actual cause. And then he has this idea that this movement, right, of movers that stretches back, right? You have cause upon cause. He would say that cannot regress to infinity. Now, the reasoning for why that is, one interpretation is that the series that he's talking about is actually what you would call it is like a vertical series, where the causes are in S. Which means that each member of the series is dependent on the previous member. So this is unlike dominoes, right? So if you line up a series of dominoes and you hit the first one, the last one coming down, right? That's not dependent on the first one once the first one has already been hit, right? They're not dependent on each other. They're just temporally like synced. So once the time passes, one doesn't depend on the other. But the actual series that some people say that Aristotle here is meaning a vertical series, which would be where each member depends on the previous member. And essentially what that means is that if it does go on to infinity, then you wouldn't have the motion you're witnessing now.
Why in dominoes case are they not dependent on each other?
So because they're temporally, they're only in time linked, right? So it's kind of like a father who begets a son, right? The causal activity of the son is not dependent on the father after he's been born. Does that make?
But I guess the existence of the son is dependent on the father.
In a loose sense, in the sense that the father had to be there at certain time to create him, right? But afterwards, it's not dependent. So your causal activity at the moment, your existence at this moment is not dependent on.
By causal
father.
activity, you mean the activity that I'm doing, and for like causal activity in the future.
Yes, and your existence in general.
Sure.
At this moment in time is not dependent on
Yeah. Fair enough.
on your previous cause, yeah. But the series that we mean here is more of a fundamental series, where each thing does depend on that which came before it. I think the example, I'm not sure which example Aristotle used. I'm remembering the example from Aquinas, which was a hand moving a stick and the stick moving a rock. So the motion of the rock is dependent on the stick, and the stick's motion is dependent on the hand. So if
Like
you take away the
yeah.
hand, then the causal link would stop at that moment.
Is it wrong to reduce Aristotle's argument for the existence of God as just saying simply, the universe is in constant motion, but there needs to be some catalyst for this motion, and so there needs to be something that set this all in place. Therefore, that has to be God.
Well, it's a type of cosmological argument, but it's
But is that a too simplistic version of what he's saying?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a bit oversimplified.
I would add that wouldn't be oversimplified if you use a different interpretation than the one I've given of why you cannot have an infinity, because some people do think he means the dominoes case where it's temporal. And his argument then would be different. So I could go through that as well. But if we are using this interpretation, then it would be too simplistic in the sense that the unmoved mover is not just there to explain why things are the way they are now. It's also there to explain why things continue to be this way. So yes, it's not about just something had to set it off, as you said, like a catalyst. Yeah, something has to sustain this existence. So it has to be here in the now, sustaining this existence that we have.
Well, it's really interesting, his conception of what the God is, right? Because he really all he says about it is that it's a thinker, that it's perpetually in the state of thought, and that's his conception of the God. So it's hard for me to connect how he because in that sense it seems like that first being God, let's say, how that is causally related to the other things. It's just it seems like to me that would just exist independent of the rest of the world as a something purely in the state of thought.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of Plato's Timaeus, when he's talking about the creation of the universe. He talks about two different kinds of causation that brings things into being from using the forms as a model in Plato's conception. And one of them is mental causation, and the other is necessity. And then there's two different kinds of necessity. But the mental causation is to respond to what you were saying,
Mm.
that was that which, following on from what you said about sustaining, not just causing things, getting things going, but sustaining it. That mental causation doesn't just have to be detached or just completely separate from that which is happening.
Mm.
I know this is Plato and Aristotle, and they're not necessarily comparable, but it's just an interesting.
But it is
Parallel.
interesting.
Yeah, and the
'cause
Timaeus it's the demiurge. that
Yeah,
feels
yeah.
different. So I don't know how right that would be.
it is interesting because he does say,
But the demiurge is mental causation,
He
right? So it is. So it's
he sets everything up in the physical universe, right? But he just didn't create the forms. That's the only thing.
yeah. He
He
uses
had
the forms
access
as
to
a
them, but he
model.
didn't create them.
Yeah. But uses cognition and reason to use the forms as a model to bring things into being. So again, yes,
he does say something like, when you think of an object, in order to think of an object, you in some sense have to, something, I'm probably misquoting this, but something like, you have to be one with that object. So in some sense,
It sounds like some hippie.
well, well, I mean, I guess in that sense, right? In order for, if God is a thinking thing, then in order for him to be able to think about other things, he has to put them into existence.
And is that him being at one with them?
I guess.
Well, it is a purely actual or actosporous being, right? So
Yeah,
it would be in
everything is
I'm
contained
gonna-
related
within
in
him,
it.
right?
I'm
Yeah.
gonna pull up the because I don't trust him. Even though I looked at this an hour ago, I don't trust myself to be accurate in my wording, and I don't want to mislead our viewers
Or us?
or you guys, but more importantly, our viewers. Because I care about them more than you guys.
That's fair.
But I'm sure all potentials already exist within God, so he can just, I guess,
well,
think.
there is no potentials within.
Oh yeah,
God.
like all the
Yeah.
potentials are actual within God.
Yeah, everything's
Yeah.
actualized. Yeah.
So I guess I don't know about the thought
All right,
stuff,
here we go.
but he can make
I'm
something
gonna read this,
potential
and then you
actual
guys tell me
thought.
what you think.
Energizing the thought.
A thought in itself deals with that which is best in itself, and that which is thought in the fullest sense with that which is best in the fullest sense. And thought thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming in contact with and thinking its objects, so that thought and object of thought are the same. And it is active when it possesses this object. Therefore, the latter, rather than the former, is the divine element which thought seems to contain, and the act of contemplation is what is most pleasant and best. If, then, God is always in that good state in which we sometimes are, this compels our wonder, and if in a better, this compels it yet more, and God is in a better state. And then he says, we say, therefore, that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration continuous and eternal belongs to God, for this is God.
It's pretty hefty.
I'll reread the thinking part.
Please.
A thought in itself deals with that which is best in itself, and that which is thought in the fullest sense with that which is best in the fullest sense. And thought thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming into contact with and thinking its objects. So that thought and object of thought are the same.
Okay, I could give it a. I could try and figure out what that was. Yes, well, this is now we're feeling like Avicenna, right? I mean, this this is what happens. Yeah. So it seems to me what you said there was that you have an object, and then you have the object of thought. So basically, the thought about that object.
Sounds like Kant.
Well, let's not go there. Because if we go to Kant, we will reach some other philosophers who I would like not to talk about today.
Almost.
So it seems like well, now you've derailed me.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's try again.
Been bamboozled by Hegel again.
Yeah, so you
Thought and object of
yes,
thought.
and the thought seems to originate through sense perception of the actual object. So in that sense, the thought would have to share a nature with the object because it comes from the object. That seems to me what
Like
he
what
said
do you
there.
mean here? A thought thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought. It becomes an object of thought and coming into contact with and thinking its objects. So that thought and object of thought are the same. The thought and the object of thought are the same.
Yeah, so it seems like it's something like the thought of the object shares the nature of the object because that's where it got the thought from.
Mm-hmm.
So originated from
But
the
then
object.
how if the objects already existed, how could God be a first thing?
Well, because if he's actuality, then the thought of that which is that which is. So he's not coming after that which already is if he is that which already is.
What do you mean?
I don't know. I'm just I don't know. I'm stabbing in the dark blindly here. What was your question?
Okay, he says
I understood the question, so maybe and I think you actually were about to answer in some capacity.
Some.
Well, you were going there, but
No, take the
no,
rest away.
no, I think it was correct. The idea that because God would be purely actual, or all his potentials would be actual, then in some sense, as we were saying before with William, that maybe all these things around us which are actual would have to share some sort of nature with that which is purely actual. So in that sense, I think your question was how would you have the thought of it without the actual thing preceding
Right.
it? But I think because he's already purely actual, maybe it's just in him already. If that
so
makes
he
sense.
just
Yeah, that's
already has
The thoughts,
the thoughts of these things in him
yeah, from himself.
from himself.
It's the best I could do, so take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And then so how then does these thoughts
Yeah, I'm a bit confused as to what thoughts actually means in this context because I have difficulty, ascribing intentionality to like God. It's difficult in general as a concept. So, what does a thought in the context of God actually mean?
This is for me, or
I don't know in general.
All right, I'll read it a
Good
little bit
answer.
before so we can get some more context. And its life is such as the best which we enjoy and enjoy for but a short time. For it is ever in this state which we cannot be, since its actuality is also pleasure, and therefore waking, perception, and thinking are most pleasant, and hopes and memories are so because of their reference to these. Thought in itself deals with which is best in itself, and that which is thought in the fullest sense with that which is best in the fullest sense. Does that help?
I mean,
So I'm still. I like your question. Like, what are we talking about here when we're talking about thoughts? Because I guess when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about my thoughts, and we're talking about God, from Aristotle's perspective. So, and the bit you just read there seemed to be suggesting that there's things to be looked at, like to go to the external world, to have memories and thoughts of things. So how does it then take us from there to God?
Well, see, I agree with you because it seems like before you have the object, you would have the potential to see the object. Or, well, or, well, I guess, how could you think of the objects? This is my, go back to my earlier question. How could you think of the objects if you didn't have the objects?
There wasn't anything to be thought of.
Yeah.
And I think I'll just go back to, I think the answer, which is that because again, I think it's because we're conceiving of ourselves here as thinking things that we run into problems, because we know that God is obviously very different from us. And in Aristotle's conception, he's actually like really different, because this idea of pure actuality is, in my opinion, quite hard to conceive of a being existing as such. And I think perhaps what he's saying there when he says the thoughts, when they're perfect, then they're identical to the object. God is already purely actual, right? So the objects would already be in him. The thoughts are basically the objects. So like the thoughts could arise from there, and the thoughts would be perfect because it's God, right? So they share the nature with the actual things in him.
So the thoughts just be identical to the actual object.
It seems like it, because he says in normal humans, right, when we perceive an object, the thoughts share the nature of the object, because that's where we got the thought. But in God, first of all, there is no like perception. Obviously, it's just in him that he gets the thought of the object. But the thought would be perfect, so it wouldn't even. It's not just going to share a nature. It seems like it would be almost indistinguishable from the object. I would still say, since we're calling it a thought, it seems like you could still say it's two different things, even if it's a perfect thought. But perhaps Aristotle was saying there won't be any distinguishing characteristic if you've got the perfect thought and the perfect object existing in one being.
So
yeah, I would take that to mean then, so when God thinks of an object, it's the same thing as just bringing the object into existence.
Well, now it's getting into the causation part, which I think is partly why he's motivated to say something about thinking, because thinking implies obviously agent causation, because it's to do with personality, right? So I think that's what's getting there. Why there's this stuff around us, like why has it continued to be sustained? So I think, yeah, you're onto something there.
But then, like, this is what I don't understand is how does it solve the problem that Aristotle's trying to fix, which is, right, that you have all these things that have actualities and potentialities, and in order for like there to be some, because if you have a potentiality, then it could also not reach the actuality, and it has to erupt. And because we said that actuality comes before potentiality, then there has to be something first that gives those things a potential to actually be those things that exist in the universe. So things like man, things like dog, things like plant, things like tree. Those things have to, right? Because it's easy to see how you can go from the potential of a plant to the potential of a tree to the tree. But as we said, the actual tree has to exist first. Well, how do you get to that? Is the question. And I don't see how he answers that by saying that. I understand his reference to God, and that makes sense as somebody who causes all this. But then when he characterizes him as a thinking thing, how does that then lead to the creation of these objects?
Would it be perhaps that the tree exists as an actual tree already in the mind of this purely actual thing?
And so in his mind, it's, and because he's divine, I guess, in his mind, like is this world just in his mind and the thinking about it, him thinking about it is actually us
Yes,
like
reality
living.
is just that, I guess.
So like the tree in his mind is equivalent to us actually in our perception a real tree.
No, I thought what the well maybe this wasn't the question. I thought the question was how could the tree pre-exist the potential, maybe, or was it more to do with the causation? Because I think the causation is, it's separate from the pure actualizer,
Like, okay,
although not in
the
a
question is,
complete
so
sense.
you have a tree coming about from the seed planted in the soil, right?
Mhm.
And the seed planted in the soil is the potential of the tree. But Aristotle would say, but the tree has existed beforehand. And in order for there to be that like first tree that existed beforehand, there has to be, it can't just be that it came from the seed, because that would just be the potential of the tree. So there has to be the tree beforehand. Where does that tree, that actual tree beforehand, come about? And I thought that like God was going to be that answer. But I'm having a hard time understanding how the thinking God brings about that tree. And my answer was maybe that he's saying that the tree, the tree that the God contemplates, because we're thinking of like an omnipotent being who in some sense is everything and is the encompasser of everything. So think about that, like the tree, him contemplating the tree in his mind is the tree that we perceive and experience, and is that real tree. And so when we think of tree, it's not the same thing as God thinking of tree. And so that's how the tree comes into being.
Well, it's kind of like what you were saying a second ago, where when we perceive something in reality, our perception is it has the essence of it or a semblance of it, but not the thing itself. And then you were speaking about the like the thought and the actuality aligning and being the same thing. So I think, God, this is confusing.
God, this is confusing.
No, it was a plea for help.
Oh well, here I come. I think there was two different things that happened there, and I'm
That
not
was
sure.
quite the arrogant statement.
Well,
No,
yeah,
I applaud.
I was set up for it, so yeah, I think there was two different things there though, because one question was how does the tree already exist, and the other one was how does the tree in this world become about, right? Am
Well, we
I
know
right
how
in
the
your
tree in this
questions?
world comes about. There's a seed and water and grows
Mhm,
and
yeah.
blah, 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 blah.
Its potential is realized, and it comes about, and this and also the fact that it still exists is all sustained by something that's purely actual.
Right.
Hmm.
But what is, how does that purely actual tree first come about?
Well, there is no purely actual. There's just an actual tree.
Okay, but that first actual tree, how does that come about? If actuality comes before potentiality.
Yeah. So
Well,
here I
it's-
think.
No, I was gonna say, well, it would go back to the first mover argument, wouldn't it? Because it's like it would come into being at the point where God, who is actuality, and there's no
Right, but it
and there's
doesn't
no.
seem like, according to Aristotle, God is the mover.
Oh, I see. I see.
I thought we just
Oh, that was
debunked that like
Aquinas. Sorry.
catalyst argument of God.
Mm.
Like he's not, like, as you said, he's not the domino that starts the whole chain of events.
Well, technically it's both, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because he starts it and then he also has to maintain it, though, kind of, I think. Right?
I mean, Aristotle does think that time is infinite. So
Oh, yeah, to
that's
be
why I
fair.
was
Yeah, that's
rejecting
true.
this interpretation of temporal, a succession of things in time, because he does
Okay.
think there's an infinite amount of events that have occurred prior to these events.
Yeah.
I think that favors the interpretation I gave for something that sustains even an infinite amount of time.
Yeah, yeah. It's important to think about the context, yeah. Nowadays, I guess infinite time is a bit hard to defend.
And so
I
how does
suppose.
his thought, God's thought, initiate this? This is the part that I'm struggling to understand. Like, how is it that this thought is not like me throwing this thing. I can't, according to us, I can't think this thing into, I can't think a car into motion. I can't think a domino falling. I have to physically do something.
Yeah, but you aren't Philip, and by that I mean God.
Yeah, he's catching on.
Crucify
Yeah.
him, crucify him.
I was actually going to say, well, you could if you were purely actual.
Yeah, but we're not. So wait,
So what purely actual literally means he's purely all of these actual things.
Well, I would say that's what I got from the passage that was read about thought and the object of thought being the same. That's the only way I could.
it sounds like it kind of delves into some kind of pantheistic route, where everything is sort of part of God.
Well,
Yes, but I don't. That's why I was saying that I don't think those things that are in God are. That's why he uses the word pre-exists, right? Because we were saying that the actual tree that we see, somehow there must have been something already like an actual tree that pre-existed it, right? And I think that goes back to the unmoved mover and the thought of the tree as being something there. So I don't think they're identical. I think that's where maybe we're going a bit different, because I don't see the tree here and the tree in God being identical trees, so that this world is just in the mind of a being. I think the being has created those things, which goes to your question, which admittedly it's quite difficult of how does this first moment of creation, I guess, come about. But I don't really have an answer, because well, unfortunately I actually have to review I'm not God.
Rats, you had me sold, man. I was committed.
So yeah, my omniscience has failed
I think
me
you're right
here.
though. When he says the thought and object of thought are the same, I don't think he's talking about God thinks of the tree, and he's literally the tree.
Yes, yeah, I don't think that's what it's meaning there.
And I think also like we need to remember that the ultimate like quest here is right, because you have physics, which is kind of the study of things like trees and fish and blah blah blah, and all these specifics. But then he's kind of
I don't know if the physicist is going to study trees. I mean, a bit more fundamental.
well, physics in the sense of
Science.
science.
Sure.
You know, a botanist is plants. I don't really know what
Zoologist, I guess.
a zoologist. No,
It's
study
animals.
trees.
No, it's animals.
What
Zoologist.
would be the study-
Herbologist? Was that
Oh, what were you talking about? Trees and what?
what would be the study of trees?
Specifically trees. Yeah, I don't know.
Because a botanist is plants.
Yeah, plants.
A treologist. Well, we didn't think,
Yeah.
when I signed up for philosophy, I didn't think I would be talking about trees this much either.
Yeah,
So,
well,
you never
it's-
know which
you don't know
subjects
what
lead
happens,
where.
Philosophy is fundamental, so it leads everywhere. We'll
But
talk
the
about
point is,
everything with
the point is,
philosophy.
right? You have all these like biology, chemistry, marine biology, etc. All these subsets of studying like the things that the actual things, and then Aristotle's saying, but I want to know what's common, what's common to all of these beings that underscores being qua being.
Yeah, I guess it's just metaphysics is the study instead of science is the study of reality, and metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality.
Right. So I guess how does this description of God give us the answer to what being is, qua being?
Well, I'm not sure if it is that answer that it's trying to answer, because yes, it's being qua being is one of those big questions in metaphysics, but there is also this idea of the origin of being, which obviously I think would be a more straightforward answer to that question. So
Fair enough.
yeah, I'm not sure it is about being qua being. Yeah. But there is that difference between the different specific subjects, because I think at one point it is said that like being can be predicated of a genus and a specific difference. So like rational animal, right? An animal is an animal would be the genus, and then rational would be the specific difference that demarcates man, for example, right? And he says that being is something that you could predicate of both things, right? You could say that there's something rational and that there's something that's an animal. And this is how he would differentiate between different subjects, because the physics would study things that are in motion and different genuses, right? Where we were talking about zoology and so on. Whilst here we're studying something above that, or something that's fundamentally more prior to that.
Man, the God stuff is confusing.
I'll drink to that. We don't have any wine though.
Aristotle doesn't strike me as a drinker, a heavy drinker.
Now, all the Greeks are definitely.
No, but
Wine.
he, Plato was kind of the man of the party. He went all the fame, got all the fame. But Aristotle was a little bit like Socrates, where he wasn't really, he was hardcore.
I have a song about philosophers that drink a lot. If you wanna
Yeah, of course, of course.
Can you play it?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, I can
of course,
sing
why
it.
wouldn't we?
Yeah, play it. Go ahead.
Sure. Immanuel Kant was a real pissant who was very rarely stable. Heidegger was a boozy beggar, he could think you under the table. David Hume could outconsume Wilhelm Friedrich, Hegel, and Wittgenstein was a beery swine who was just as sloshed as Schlegel. There's nothing Nietzsche couldn't teach about the raising of the wrist. Socrates himself was permanently pissed. John Stuart Mill, of his own free will, on half a pint of shandy was particularly ill. Plato, they say, he could put it away. Half a crate of whiskey every day. Aristotle was a bugger for the bottle. Hobbes was fond of a dram. Rene Descartes was a drunken fart. I drink, therefore I am. And Socrates himself is particularly missed. A lovely little think about a bugger when he's pissed. The Philosopher's Song.
It's from Monty Python.
It is
isn't
Monty
it?
Python, well recognised.
I have heard this.
I
Before.
thought you created
Very
that on
good,
your own
though.
until you
Impressive that you've come and remember all the lyrics now.
I know.
I remember
I know,
just that I drink, therefore I am, and some of the main
I know a
ones.
lot of Monty Python.
No, but you
sorry.
have to remember.
Have you seen the Monty Python football philosopher match?
Okay, but,
No?
but enough Monty Python aside. You have to remember Aristotle was Macedonian, so he's hardcore.
Oh,
He's he's top of the top. He's,
Alexander the Great.
He's he mentored Alexander the Great. You got to remember these are not your average Joe people. These are your what Nietzsche would refer to as your Ubermenschens. These are like top guns. So
big G's.
they've
Represent.
yeah. So it wouldn't appear to me that Aristotle would sink that low. It's a banquets and like the Romans did. He's
Yeah, the Romans are absolute degenerates. It's true. At least the Greeks had some dignity. Some.
class. That's the word I'm looking for.
And this is all related because Aristotle argues for a god that we would later find out supposedly turns water into wine. This is how it all comes about.
Nice. Tied a nice bow on there then.
Yeah, exactly.
Was Jesus a drinker, do you think?
Well, I mean, he turned the water into wine. I don't know if he, then chugged
But
it
that was
down.
for
I mean,
that
why
was
wouldn't
for
he,
that
take a
was
sip?
for that was for a wedding.
Oh, all right. But I mean, to be fair, Jesus is human, right? So he's perfectly human. So he should still have the.
I don't know if he's
You know.
perfectly human.
Well, I guess it's a big theological debate, right? Whether he's divine or not. But some people would hang you, burn you to the stake, whatever, for saying. Well, not anymore, obviously, but
Would hang me?
not hang.
I mean, I was preparing
Execute
to for
you.
all these heresies that are coming
Yeah.
up. Yeah, I think you would drink. I mean, nowadays, I think, don't they drink? They eat bread and they drink wine, right? These
Yeah,
are
I mean,
Christians,
they
so-
do it when you get when you have the
Communion.
communion. They give you the bread and the
Exactly,
wine.
so-
Yeah, yeah.
But the question is,
That's part of Jesus, supposedly for the
His
Catholics,
blood,
his
yeah.
blood
Blood.
and his body. Yeah.
but
I mean,
would he
if
get
he
high
already
on his own
has-
supply though?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
I guess we'll never know.
Anyway, that's probably enough for today.
Yeah, I think so.
That was a
place
good
to wrap it
ending
up.
segment, I guess.
Yeah.
I
And
appreciate it.
on the song, we should do this every time, you know.
Yeah. I'll remember some more Monty Python next time.
Yeah. Anyway,
Gents, thank you very much for coming back on. Brilliant.
and
No worries, I enjoyed it very much.
do your little subscribe, follow,
Like and subscribe.
and send us articles, please.
What he said.
And Instagram, Twitter, you know what to do.
Thank you, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Congratulations if you've made it this far.
Yeah, I seriously doubt it. If you're here, you're one of our loyal customers.
Hi, Jason.
Respect.